It's been a fascinating day for those attending the G20 Summit in New Delhi, and no less intriguing for our very own Ewan O'Neill, who's on the rooftop at our special studio for our continuing coverage of the G20.
Yeah, the opening day at the G20 forum here in New Delhi, the first time the nation has ever held the summit, is a wrap, and a lot was decided upon today. Just to go through some of the main issues now. The G20 member states have agreed on a joint declaration that was announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi earlier, and it really signals a big event change, because there had been talk it wouldn't happen the first time. A joint communique may not happen because the sticking points were the Ukraine conflict and also who's going to pay for climate change. So that appears to have been ironed out. We await the final communique tomorrow, Sunday, and when that comes out, we will of course bring it to you in detail and just go through the fine print. But it does seem to be a type of victory, at least for Russia, because it appears to maintain a neutral stance without directly condemning Moscow. The G20 has called for a peaceful resolution of the conflict as well. It is worth noting that the G20 may not, going forward, be known as that any longer, because the African Union is to become the latest fully fledged member. So G21 may be just around the corner. That had been promoted for some years. Russia did it, China did it, and now India give its backing, invited the African Union to join, and they seem to have fully agreed to that. Let's have a look at the remarks from Prime Minister Narendra Modi on that.
This period in the 21st century is the time to give the entire world a new direction. It is a time when all challenges demand new solutions, and therefore we must fulfill our responsibilities with a human-centric approach. India has become a symbol of inclusion. India has proposed permanent membership for the African Union in G20. I am confident that we have consensus on this proposal.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced the official inclusion of African Union into the G20 bloc. What's expected tomorrow is that G20 will likely become G21. So we'll have to watch out for that announcement. But this is big, and also on the lines of what India's presidency stood for, Global South. Remember, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had written to heads of all states asking for inclusion, rather giving African Union full membership of the bloc. Remember, African Union is a mega grouping, 55 countries we're talking about. So really a more inclusive decision taken by Mr. Narendra Modi, and then the entire bloc, so to say, it got a strong response from the entire G20 bloc. And this is really going to benefit both sides, is what experts say. And finally, the big news from the G20 venue at Pragati Maidan here is that yes, there will be a joint communique, and this is big win for India. Remember, India's role as a mediator, as a power broker, as a negotiator was being talked about, and India finally was able to do that.
In a way, the G20 itself is a reflection of multipolarity. The fact that there was, in a way, the salience of G7 was a decade ago replaced by the salience of the G20. I think that itself was a statement. Now, what you see before you in terms of the leaders' declaration and the discussions that are going on are obviously discussions among a very broad, very diverse range of countries at different levels of economic development, whose economic and social, cultural composition is quite different from each other. So I think in that sense it's quite reasonable to assume that there is a certain there's a spectrum of views and interests out here which we have tried to harmonize to produce the declaration.
Remember, the bloc was divided, Russia and China on one side, also the West on the other. The West really trying to make this forum, which really stands for international economic cooperation, into a battleground to discuss geopolitical issues. So really, day one and major announcements by India. Of course, there are going to be several bilaterals and sessions tomorrow as well.
Just to point out, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is representing Russia's interests at the G20 plenary sessions. With more on that, let's hear from RT's Maria Finoshna.
Sergei Lavrov's mission at the summit in New Delhi was, among other things, to draw the attention of the participants to Moscow's concerns about repeated and various Western attempts to politicize the G20 global gathering, again like last year, and their pressure on India, specifically coming from G7 countries like the UK, France and Germany, under the supervision of the US, as they sought to reflect their unilateral approach to the situation around Ukraine in the final documents of the summit. Russia called it Ukrainization of the G20 and strongly condemned it. India also repeatedly made it clear it is an economic forum and should remain as such. India refused, despite Western demands, to invite the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to participate in any of the G20 events here on the Indian soil. Finally, Russia has praised the results of the first day and the summit's declaration that mentions Ukraine but notably does not condemn Russia's involvement. That is in stark contrast to the harsher stance laid out in the previous year's declaration in Indonesia that described Russia as an aggressor. Here is what Russia's envoy, responsible for negotiations, pre-summit consultations and advocating Moscow's position, told us about the newly issued document.
I can say that these were very difficult negotiations regarding the Ukraine crisis. First of all, the collective position of the BRICS countries and other partners probably has worked. Half of the 20 member states refuse to interpret the events in the way that the West wants. We heard all the accusations against Russia for the whole year. There were claims that the Ukrainian conflict has provoked the deterioration of the food security situation. Now the approach is reflected in a balanced form. That's today, and you will see it tomorrow. It is the language of consensus and the intention to act. It is also important that not only developing economies have come to a common position, but also the G7 group of countries and the entire collective West have signed up for this.
It seems that the balanced global position on the Ukrainian conflict was not the only achievement, as G20 participants were able to resist the Western pressure on other issues as well.
It was probably one of the most difficult summits of the group of 20 in the history of the forum at the leaders level. The approval of the declaration took almost 20 days before the summit, and here 5 days on the ground. The task was to reserve the trend that has always existed in international organizations, multilateral platforms working in the interests of the West. This year, the G20 is the voice of the developing world. From my point of view, this is the key achievement of this year's New Delhi summit.
Although the declaration was published, the summit continues. On Sunday, Russia's foreign minister will be speaking at the final One Future session, promoting democracy and strengthening position of the countries belonging to the global majority that Russia is a part of. We have to wait and see what the second day will bring us.
Let's speak now to Professor Faisal Ahmed, specialist on Indo-Pacific geopolitics and trade policy.
When you are talking about the global south, you are not necessarily talking about a one country leadership. I mean, I just want to point out this fact, which is very significant. When we are talking like this G20 which is happening, it's all about inclusive multilateralism. It's not focusing on, something like an assertion of a power status or coming with an alternative model of development which was never there in the world. Unlike the United States. I mean, if you look at the United States would push for a model of governance which believes that is the best in the world. But if you talk about India, if you talk about China, if you talk about Russia, they are not talking that their model is the best in the world. They are talking about inclusive multilateralism, that everyone comes together, build a common platform and develop common solutions for each other. Global South have their own challenges, and these challenges can be anything related to whether you talk about poverty or development related challenges or infrastructure financing. All these challenges are there in the Global South. Therefore, the solution lies in coming together. That's how you build common, solutions, when you are coming together on a common platform, and then you understand that, okay, this is going to make sense for them. This is going to come out with have some pragmatic outcome in terms of that. So therefore, I think African Union coming into it will be very beneficial for the countries of Africa.